Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, here in New York City. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, if you're following this out there on the World Wide Web via the 1.8 million pages of syscon.com, cloudcomputingexpo.com. Thank you for joining us here. We've got an incredibly full keynote room. We've already opened up the overflow room next door, so we can conclude, without stealing the thunder from our keynote speaker, that there's something going on with cloud. We're going to be exploring it, as you know, for 4 days. How many people are here for the whole 4 days? Oh, this is, well, I take my hat off to you. 4 days of cloud. So let's start it with our keynote. I won't steal anyone's thunder. He's going to introduce someone even more special. So I'm going to introduce a special person. Who's going to introduce an even more special person? I'm not giving anything away, right, Steve? Okay, give it up for Steve Schuckenbrock. But before we say hello to him, let's just bear in mind his background. President of Dell IT Services, Dell Services, but with a sneaky EDS background, and he's been CIO of Dell. So that's quite germane, I think, when we're talking cloud, because you know our emphasis, Cloud Expo, has always been on the cloud as a business solution. That's always been our special emphasis, the enterprise. I'm sure that's what's brought a lot of you here. We're not saying there aren't consumer things going on. I know that iCloud will be launched this week because Apple know that this is the beginning of the summer of cloud. So let's listen to Steve, listen to who he's introducing, and there's a special introduction for you all. Steve Schuckenbrock from Dell.
First of all, welcome to everybody. It's terrific to be in the room with such a packed house, and thanks to those that are sitting next door. You know, it's really a delight to be in this room. I first came to my first experience with the Javits Center was PC Expo 26 years ago. And I remember the keynote from that meeting where, frankly, we were debating the pros and cons of various different operating systems that might or might not dominate the market someday. And now we're sitting here, I think, on the cusp of an even bigger wave in computing than we've ever experienced before in our lives. And so I'm really excited to talk to you about it. But before I jump in, you know, being part of this room really kind of makes you feel a bit of a pioneer in that next big wave. And, you know, we happen to have a pioneer founder by the name of Michael Dell, who I really wanted to be here with you. He actually is the kind of guy that would stay for the full 4 days if he could find the time, and hit every single booth and learn every single detail he could. He's the most intellectually curious guy I've ever worked with in my life. But I'd like to introduce him, at least by video, because he had a few things to share. Michael?
Hello, Steve and Cloud Expo attendees. I wish I could be there with you in person, because I imagine the next few days of presentations and discussions are going to spark a whole new set of ideas and thinking around the cloud. It's a topic I'm very passionate about. A couple weeks ago, I wrote a story in Forbes about my own perspective on the cloud and the promise it holds. We are now at a point where the expectations of every user I know are driving a fundamental shift in the way all of us work and serve our customers. I call this yes, now computing. Yes, we want applications and seamless connectivity and security, and we want all that now, without delay, on demand. The attitude of yes, now is defining and shaping the future of IT. And I believe the cloud is the single most important enabler we have today to meet the needs of billions of IT users worldwide. Together, we need to literally part the cloud and begin to define real business results and real value. I think all of you would agree that we have a tremendous opportunity and a lot of work ahead of us. And there's never been a more exciting time to be in IT. I hope you have a super show, and be sure and spend some time with the Dell Cloud team over the next couple of days here in New York. Thanks, and now back to you, Steve.
Actually, the volume was turned all the way down. You can tell he's a little fired up about this topic. And we spend a lot of time talking about cloud, but most importantly, talking about how cloud can benefit our customers and our customers' customers, and what role Dell can play in enabling and unlocking this wave I talked about or mentioned before. You know, Michael mentioned two simple words, this notion of yes and now. And while they're very, very simple words, I do think they convey an expectation of the user community where this, sort of mindset of anything I want, anywhere I want it, any time that I'd like to have access to it, is the expectation. And frankly, there's no tolerance for downtime. And that is a pretty high demand, but the reality is it's unstoppable as a force that will drive all of the end users that we support and we work with every day. My kids are a fantastic example of this. I have 5 children. One of my sons was trying to get into UT. And he's the son who sort of takes his time and everything's cool and it's not going to be a big problem and Dad, get off my back and all that kind of stuff. So maybe like the 5th or 6th time at a dinner table, I was on him about, when are you going to hear back and what is the process? My 16-year-old daughter sort of got tired of it. So over on the other side of the table, she's over here going, well, honestly, he should know by May 16th. But the ones who are really sort of specially qualified already know by now. Because not that she had any affiliation with the university, she was just tired of the conversation. And what I needed to know was available, he just wouldn't give it to me. And it is the mindset that whatever you want to do, wherever you want to do it, you can get it done. And it's critical. But I think in addition to talking about the end user computing mindset and where that's all headed, it's important that we stop talking about all the different ways that the cloud gets delivered and focus on the business outcomes for those end users. How in fact can the cloud fundamentally shift or enable business strategies and turn those companies that embrace it into the leading companies within industry or within the whatever type enterprise it might be, versus the laggards. And I think there's really going to be a defined difference as we sort through this era. So before we jump too far into this, let's move to kind of a history lesson around where we've come from. I mentioned that I was here 26 years ago, but this started only about 60 years ago where the IT industry was formed. And it's only had 5 major eras. I mean, if you think about it, the mainframe, distributed computing, client server, I would say the internet was the 4th major era. And I believe we're entering what I call the virtual era. And the virtual era is where everything is virtualized, from the most public of public clouds down to applications that run on your smartphone. And that you have the ability to move seamlessly across all of the various different providers of information, and you can create information that is enabling applications within those clouds. But I do remember, the mainframe sat with it with a very few companies that could afford them. When I went to college, I'm ashamed to admit that, quite frankly, I had to sign up for time in order to complete certain classes in the library. And when you go through and you consider that and the expectations that I just described from our kids, where these devices can do anything, and you think about the kind of applications that these devices will enable. This happens to be a remote, but if you think about the smartphone, though, with a camera, with access to all the social media you could possibly imagine, think about its ability to run secured applications. You think about the mobility of the device itself. I was talking to a group of CIOs across the airline industry, and one of the big things they wrestle with is plane maintenance. And when I was talking to that group of CIOs, they said, well, now with that device, when we have a plane that's down anywhere in the world and needs maintenance, I can actually send an untrained technician into the area of problem. They can actually use the camera to video the corrosion in that particular area of the plane. They can stream that video back to an expert center that can help diagnose the problem. we can immediately, through that video, give them access to all of the parts that are going to be necessary to fix that problem. We can download the specific section of the training manual, and we can use social media to identify the people within a proximity of that specific area because of the GPS capability that are qualified to fix that plane and get it back up in the air. And by the way, we can use all of that and connect it to our parts management system and make sure we get the parts to them on time. That was not an application they ever contemplated doing until the combination of cloud capability and mobility itself came into being. And I think this is what's going to define the virtual era in terms of how we enable those kinds of applications. This is putting enormous pressure on CIOs and on IT organizations overall. On the one hand, there's an expectation for yes and now. I want what I want it now. In fact, this notion that instantaneous gratification is not quite fast enough. But by the same token, there's this enormous push for efficiency. And it started a few years ago, quite frankly, as the virtualization engine was kind of clicking along, and all of a sudden the economy took a dive. And everybody had to go virtualize their environments at a much more accelerated pace than they had previously been on. And they did invest money to save a significant amount. Well, let me tell you, the intensity of that period relative to the intensity brought on by the efficiency of cloud architectures is nothing. I mean, if you consider the fact that, if you go to the largest clouds in the world and you think about those large clouds and you begin to say, okay, well, how many administrators do they have per server? About 1 for every 5,000. How many do we have in most traditional data centers? About 1 for every 50. When you think about the utilization of storage and of server capacity, they are outstripping traditional data centers by leaps and bounds. When you think about power and cooling efficiency, there's no comparison. There's up to a 10x difference on some of those metrics alone. So these data centers are running for substantially less money. And your CEOs and CFOs are reading in magazines about the efficiency of the Amazon data center. They also might have read a few other things lately, but they'll be overcome. And so when they read these things through and they understand that that's a very different economic footprint, the question is, how do we get there? And so the torque that you feel as IT professionals and as CIOs feel as leaders in their organizations to accommodate an instantaneous gratification mindset simultaneously with this massive drive for efficiency puts more torque in the rope than we've ever seen before. And I think the cloud offers phenomenal solutions to that torque. But it's going to be a really important walk between here and full adoption of the potential of the cloud. And I think all of you as pioneers and as leaders in this change have a great opportunity to help companies and organizations of all types walk their way through the migration and the execution. This notion of yes now, I think, is going to begin to accelerate the divide between companies who get IT and execute it well and companies that are laggards and don't invest in modern architectures. And the architecture does matter in the cloud. I am not familiar with any cloud running on a mainframe. I know I could get some arguments on that. I'm not familiar with any clouds running on closed proprietary architecture. And we are the primary provider of infrastructure to 17 of the top 25 clouds in the world. And so we're pretty familiar with the architectures that they're running and the stacks of software that they run on top of them. We have to make decisions as leaders about how we are going to architect our journey to the benefits that the cloud can enable for our organizations, or how we're going to cling to the decisions that have caused, good enough yesterday, but nowhere near good enough for tomorrow. And so yes now is a pretty important concept to embrace, because maybe in later, isn't going to work. And I promise you that those companies that have really paid attention to how to modernize their infrastructure and move to open standards and embrace the architectures as they've evolved over the last 20 or 30 years and put those architectures in place have a head start relative to those organizations that are coming from a monolithic, siloed, proprietary past. So, decisions. People get to make choices when we hit these crossroads, and it's not the first time that we've, as a team, been faced with these kinds of crossroad decisions. But what I believe is different this time is that the speed of innovation and the power of the benefit associated with cloud-based architectures and the ability to run business applications on those architectures will drive a faster gap between those that get it and those that choose to lag behind. And most of the survey data that we've gathered confirms that people are beginning to lean in really hard as opposed to stand back. Before we get too down about the challenges, I think it's appropriate to acknowledge the enormous progress and value that IT has provided to industry up to this point. And I'd like to introduce a couple of things to you. First of all, if you look at the world economy and the value that technology has driven in that world economy, there's no industry that parallels it. Second is within any enterprise, there is a dynamic that takes place. If you look at this chart, you can kind of look at what I represent in the green box here as the senior executives who may have really great perspective. They understand the markets that they're trying to serve. They understand the competitors in those markets and the strategies that they're trying to put in place in order for those their businesses or their organizations to thrive. But then I look at the knowledge workers, and they may be 7 or 8 layers away in the organization, but they know everything about their customers. They know everything about how the value proposition works in a sale, day in and day out. They know about how well the support offerings are actually resonating. They know what the competitors are doing at every moment in the life cycle of their responsibilities. They understand the business processes. Their knowledge base is huge. And we have this great example of this right in our own company. I mean, when Michael founded Dell in his dorm room in 1984, he was the only employee. So he had great perspective. He knew everything about what he was trying to do. And he also took the orders, ordered the parts, built the machines, delivered the machines, billed for the machines, and serviced the machines. So he had fantastic knowledge. He might say that it was the last time the CEO of the company knew what the heck was going on. But it's a really important thing for us to understand that it's that gap that has developed over time as companies scale, as organizations scale, as we do mergers and acquisitions, as we begin to globalize, we add complexity that draws a widening of the gap between fantastic knowledge of the business and the perspective and the strategies that want to shape it. And if we can close that gap, those companies win. Those organizations win. Huge amount of cost gets taken out, not just in the IT infrastructure, but in the execution of the business itself. And it matters. It matters a lot. However, let's go back to this time clock. That drumbeat, this instantaneous gratification, the belief that IT is always behind and has to catch up, and somehow or another it's too slow and too expensive, is this thing that started as like a bass drum in the background, and now it feels like a snare drum that's just pounding right behind your back as you're trying to get these projects executed. And I do believe that as that occurs, we can summarize the role of IT as the enabler of this compression between perspective and knowledge. This thing that closes that gap both directions. So that frontline employees who serve and touch your customers every day or your suppliers or your students can actually make decisions because they have the context for the decisions that they're making. They're smart people. They just need permission to do things within the strategy. And conversely, as CEOs and senior executives can make much better decisions because they're informed by the reality of what happens every day. We're going to talk about a few examples in a minute. So, before we do, let's talk about the cloud. It's a great term. I like it. It's interesting, but it also is open for hundreds of definitions. And we sort of add to this by throwing in a new something as a service. Every time people learn the last three, we add another one. And then we talk about all these wonderful sort of acronyms of SOA and GUI and dedupe and auto-tiering and botnet and cloudified and blah, 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 blah. And the users are like, oh my God, why did I call them? Right? I don't know what they're talking about. And yet, we as IT professionals, and I've been a CIO, I was CIO at PepsiCo, I've done CIO for higher businesses, I was a CIO at Dell. I've fallen into this trap many times myself, and these TLAs TLAs, what does that stand for? Three-letter acronyms. We make them up all the time. But, we have to take responsibility for shifting this discussion. We have to take away this ambiguity that gets created with the techno-speak. I got a pretty decent example of it on the next page. If you look at that diagram, it looks like a fairly straightforward diagram to most of the technical people in the audience. It's logical, things flow, they connect, understand the role of each box on that thing, makes sense. And we get ourselves wrapped up in SD-RAM and Y control buffers and all sorts of stuff. But really all this is a flat screen television. That's all that diagram represents, is how does a flat screen television work. But you don't find the guy at Best Buy saying, let me give you some options here. Your SD-RAM can run at this speed, that speed, or that speed. Now let me give you the advantages and the disadvantages of the different speeds and suddenly your head just hurts. And frankly, once you tell me about this stuff, I want to optimize it. So if you tell me all about these working mechanisms, I want to get in and say, well, what if I turn this one up a little bit and turn down that and that? In the end, it creates lots of jobs. It creates lots of complexity. It creates lots of cost. And why do you think, based on the fact that we as IT professionals have turned every one of those knobs across all of the buttons we have to push through the years, why do you think users think we're too slow and too expensive? It's unnecessary complexity. And I do think the cloud architectures provide an enormous way out of that complexity. And yes, it's consolidation, and yes, it's standardization, and yes, it's virtualization, and yes, it's all automation. It's 1 to 5,000 systems administrators. You couldn't do that if every flat TV or computer was configured locally. So there's a lot of hype. We talked about anything as a service. We talked about private. We talked about public. We talked about hybrids. Every variation of PaaS, IaaS, TaaS, so on and so forth. You guys know the drill. I do think it's important for us to recognize that cloud really exists as a continuum of this maturing industry. Our industry is, 60 years old, roughly, maybe a little bit, maybe a little older, but basically 60 years old. If you go back and you look at how it has evolved, it's actually matured at a much faster rate than any of the other professions that report to the CEO. For God's sakes, finance goes back to the Romans, and engineering goes back to the Egyptians. And so, these professions have had a long time to mature. IT has matured at a very, very rapid rate, and now the culmination of its maturity is highly standardized, open architected infrastructure that provides the flexibility through development platforms to run that particular application in a multitude of locations with the flexibility to optimize that based on the business need and the economics. In a nutshell, that's what it is. That's a very methodical, thoughtful evolution that is an exclamation point on this journey that we've been taking over the last 60 years. And so I feel terrific about being able to defend the fundamental structure that exists underneath the cloud and why it's something we can place really heavy, heavy bets against as we begin to evolve as a industry or as a profession to serve this insatiable need that I referred to before. And that insatiable need is not only the speed and flexibility that it also involves the efficiency and the enormous drive for efficiency. So I want to be careful to be pragmatic, to not be too technical when we talk about this, to not overhype it as the end-all be-all, it's going to solve every single problem you've ever had. I think it's important that we talk about it on a continuum, and I think it's exceptionally important that we help our end users understand how they can extract value through this change. So let's go back to this notion of shrinking the gap between knowledge and perspective. A great IT department in a cloud era, one, absolutely not just sits at the table, but is engaged in driving business outcomes at the table, is talking in business language, not IT speak. They're very focused on the benefits, the end user benefits, not as perceived by a single end user, but as perceived as a strategic capability across the company's strategy, and can really work on the migration to the cloud that is appropriate for the variety of different applications they support. Companies are not either cloud or not cloud. Some small organizations may get there faster. But their applications will exist, some in a cloud realm, some in a virtualized data center realm, some still in a legacy realm, probably 5 to 10 years from now. But a massive shift in weight is going to occur on the cloud. And it's also an organization that understands that by creating standards and by migrating their applications to those standards, that they will minimize the cost of maintenance and the cost of running, and they will minimize the complexity in the back end and maximize the money that that company or that enterprise has to put against innovation. And I've seen this in play. I mean, Dell itself, when I took over Dell IT, we spent 94% of $1.3 billion running IT. We now spend 50% of $1.1 billion running IT. All of the balance goes to innovation, which is on top of our highly standardized and highly consolidated footprint, enabling us to move to cloud pretty quickly. So that's kind of the challenge, and that's really the environment that I believe is possible. But I don't think this is constrained really by the notion of execution. We've already talked about the great job that we've done to date as a profession. We've talked about the value that technology plays. I really think this comes down to leadership and a responsibility to bridge the divide in communication that exists between how to build a cloud and then how to maximize the benefit across your enterprise. Let me give you a couple of examples. On this example, it happens to be a hospital organization, roughly 8 hospitals in India. This particular organization decided that they really needed to get control of the patient health records. They believed that they should put those records in the cloud. And so we have now built with them the very first patient health record management system in the cloud in India, which sounds great. And it's actually served them quite nicely. You know, they have this ability to cut paperwork by some, $500,000 or some such number. They have the ability to reduce the amount of time that they spend with patients. So patients actually have to spend in the hospital by a full day. That's a significant advantage from a cost and from a service standpoint to their patients. But what they've really started figuring out is now that I have all of this health information associated with each of the patients that I serve, and I can begin to look at patterns of treatment, some that were successful and some that maybe were not as successful given similar symptoms, and I could even associate that patient's DNA records with the enormous amount of research associated with genomics, and I can tailor treatment specifically to the individual needs of each patient based on the treatment and the genomics information. Wow, I could change lives forever. That's doable. This is a conversation, and we're not doing it yet with Max Healthcare. This is where they're going. This is why they've made the decision to get health records in the cloud as opposed to locking them up inside of the EMR. Another example. This happens to be a school system in Georgia, Hall County Schools. They are facing enormous budget pressures, just like the healthcare example a few minutes ago in the US. We're all familiar with that. Well, think about the school systems and the papers that you're reading in your local towns. I can't think of a single one that's not under tremendous pressure. And so this leader brought together administrators, teachers, parents, students, and had roundtable after roundtable after roundtable and collected information about how should it work given the constraints we all face. And they've created a blended learning environment in the cloud. Dell has helped build this with them. It's an open source platform for teachers and for students. It allows the teachers to adjust the curriculum to the individual needs of every single student and monitor the progress of that student relative to their customized curriculum. And they can make adjustments and changes to that curriculum on a single student at a time kind of basis. It is a phenomenal success with this team. And again, it's cheaper, it's more effective, but it's fundamentally enabling outcomes in people's lives that you couldn't have enabled before you started to embrace this notion of business impact of the cloud, not just the cloud for cloud's sake. And if I look at Dell, we are big Chatter users. We're big Salesforce.com users. I think the largest Salesforce.com implementation in the world. We've just embraced Chatter. We now have 103,000 employees signed up to use Chatter. Michael and his whole management team use Chatter on a day in and day out basis. And now let's go back to this thing of perspective and knowledge. Our frontline sales teams actually enter information about here's my account plan, here's my strategies for achieving success, these are the proposals that I've turned in at this customer, this is the feedback that I've received, this is the competitive situation that I find myself in, and they get to hear from other peers with similar kinds of concerns. Put that on the knowledge worker continuum. Michael and the rest of the team, we actually write about our strategies, and we put them in Chatter. This speech will go into Chatter. All the feedback from you will go into Chatter. And our teams have the ability then to say, well, I think I understand the strategy. And the senior leadership team reads about, I can put a keyword into Chatter that says, compellant sales proposals. And I can get back all the information real time about how we're doing against EMC, how we're doing against NetApp, where they're winning and where we're winning and why. And suddenly my strategy and my frontline knowledge collapse. And I have the ability to move faster in my decisions and hopefully create an advantage against the competition. And so this is another example of not doable before these kinds of technologies were embraced and fully deployed and utilized. Beyond that, you look at Dell in the cloud. I got questions already a few minutes ago about what we're doing in the cloud. I actually received a challenge from a gentleman in the audience to do more. I'll take that challenge. We'll go try to figure that out. But we do a lot. We do 2.4 million B2B transactions with customers every single day, leveraging Dell's cloud. 4,600 B2B partner interfaces supported in the cloud. Billions of dollars of payments transacted through the cloud on a day in and day out basis. We've reduced transaction costs for those payments to 2 cents per transaction. Manually, it'd be $30. You think about Salesforce.com, we've got 30,000 employees and 50,000 partners all connected to our instance of Salesforce.com, interacting every day. And through all of this, we took 400 applications that we used to support in the old way. Doesn't matter what they were running on. There was 400 applications built to specific functional purposes, and we shrunk it to 23. And we ripped out all the server infrastructure, all the network infrastructure, every other part of the infrastructure that used to do it the old way in a siloed fashion where utilization was 15 to 20%, and now we do it in a modern fashion where utilization is up into the 50, 60% kind of range. So we have some things we really want to do in partnership with you. Quite honestly, the best thing we can do is listen to you and hear what works, what doesn't work, what the journey is like for your particular organization and enterprise. We've commissioned a study with The Economist. We really chose The Economist carefully because they can get to the heart of the business value that these computing models can bring. And it's important for us that we know how to have the right conversation with the C-suite so that we can begin to move along this continuum that I described earlier. So you may get surveyed while you're here. You may be asked for your thoughts relative to the things that we're talking about and the other things that you hear at this event. When that's done, and we've kind of pulled all of that research together, it'll be published. So we plan to be extremely transparent about everything that we learn with anybody and everybody who wants to consume it. If you'll stop by our booth, we'll make sure and leave a card. We'll make sure we send a copy to you so that you've got access to the same research that we have access to. We've announced that we're investing $1 billion in infrastructure. We're building 10 cloud data centers. We're building solution centers around the world where we can bring our teams and your teams together to be able to put together proof points and proofs of concepts around all of this cloud as well as broader solution base. We're opening an R&D center for cloud. It'll be announced by the Prime Minister in Ireland tomorrow. And so we're going to have a research and development capability in Ireland that has I think, pretty robust, pretty huge impact on our speed to innovation around the cloud. And I'm focusing that team specifically on business impact, not architecture. We are moving customers from their proprietary background to open. We have dozens and dozens and dozens of examples of those migrations. So you kind of get the feeling, you might have known Dell as a hardware company. Well, think about the acquisition of Boomi. I hope you stop by the Boomi booth out here, because what customers told us is that the two biggest concerns they had, and they sort of flip-flopped as to which one was the biggest and which one was second, was integration. Boomi is the best integration platform for cloud-to-cloud and cloud-to-legacy systems available in the market. Dell owns that technology, and we're quite excited about bringing that technology to bear to help you achieve the business impact we're describing. The second one was security. And when you think about security, we bought the #1 rated managed security company in the world, and we're integrating that, we're still providing that service to thousands and thousands of customers. We literally get 13 billion malicious attempts per day that actually get filtered through their technology and sorted down to a small number of actual threats. And then we have a cyber threat unit that triages every one of those threats, including some of the most popular ones you've read about in the newspaper, in order to make sure Dell can bring you a cloud that can be integrated and secured. So we're pretty excited about this space, and from an M&A standpoint, as well as from an organic investment standpoint, we're making lots of progress, but it really matters what brings value to you. And that's the reason we're here with a pretty large presence this week. Because just like PC Expo 26 years ago, we think we're on the start of something really, really important. It so happens that Dell was founded just 27 years ago. Well, Dell's cloud business, we think, is a huge contributor to our future because it's a huge contributor to yours. And we believe that we bring credibility to bear in an open, architected, capable technology, affordable total cost of ownership orientation, and a services capability that can unlock business benefit as opposed to just hardware benefit. And we think that's the way this thing is going to evolve. You know, all of that said, I promise transparency. I promise to bring clarity and examples and reference cases like a couple that I've referenced, but those are 2 of dozens that we can put on the table with you so that you can bring those to bear within your businesses. Consultative capability to help you achieve what you're trying to achieve with the cloud. We will focus intensely on security. We will focus intensely on making sure you can meet the regulatory and integration requirements that you have in your business that tend to be the challenges that come up with any of your organizations. We'll be honest about what's doable and what's not doable. Because, frankly, all of the problems that are real, that have been identified and associated with the cloud, haven't been solved yet. And therefore, it's really good for some uses and not quite so good for some other users. And the best thing we can do is at least give you our view as to which things sort into which stack. Over time, through listening to you, you'll realize our commitment to innovating with you to solve those problems. And I believe that you'll have a 99.9999 secured, integrated, hyper capability that spans between private and public, and that we can work together to help solve that problem. And so, in closing, I think the world has now changed. We are in a very different place now because the cloud is that next evolution, natural evolution for our industry. We believe, and I think you would agree, that architecture absolutely matters, that those conversations can be hard in business. They don't tend to want to give you $10 million for architecture, or 100, or whatever your number might be. What they tend to want you to do is work on the business problem and come back, and whatever architecture you have to enable to give them the ultimate trade-off between efficiency that is massive compared to where they've been, and flexibility and speed in this insatiable drumbeat that you know exists from the end user communities. We believe that that time is here. We believe that leadership is going to matter. We believe that what we have to do is be trusted engagement teams for you. I don't want to say trusted partners because it's overhyped. I want an honest conversation about what you can do, where your business is, what's unique about you, and how to bring all of these capabilities to bear. And I believe when we have that kind of an honest conversation, all of you will come to the conclusion that it really is the time for yes, and it is the time for now. Thank you very much.